So ADHD isn't a character flaw. It's not a brain flaw or a disorder. It's not a lack of motivation. It's a nervous system doing its best to adapt. Your brain isn't broken. It's actually brilliant. It's just that it learned to survive because it didn't feel safe. Welcome back to the Mind Change Podcast. Today's episode is going to flip everything you thought you knew about ADHD on its head. Because what if ADHD isn't a disorder? What if it's a deeply intelligent response to early emotional chaos? A brilliant adaptation to a world that didn't feel safe? And what if the fidgeting, the forgetfulness, the racing thoughts aren't signs of dysfunction, but signs of a nervous system doing whatever it had to survive? We're going to dive into the real emotional drivers behind ADHD. What happens in a developing brain when core needs aren't met? How school systems and social expectations actually reinforce the problem. And why medication, while sometimes helpful, may also keep people trapped in a lifelong loop of outsourcing regulation. We'll also unpack what ADHD might be symbolizing on a metaphysical level, and how with the right tools, rewiring strategies, the same brain that once felt chaotic can become one of your greatest assets. If you or someone you love struggles with ADHD, this episode is for you. Let's move beyond labels, beyond shame, and into understanding. Let's get started. Joining me for today's conversation is my partner and co-founder of Mind Change, Kent McKean. Welcome back.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Of course. Wouldn't be a conversation without you.
All right. So ADHD.
Okay.
There we go.
So before we dig deeper into all of this, let's ground this conversation in reality because the numbers don't lie.
Okay.
And ADHD diagnoses are skyrocketing. In the US, more than 6 million children have been diagnosed with ADHD. That's nearly 1 in 10. And among adults, diagnosis rates have quadrupled in the last 15 years. So globally, ADHD is now one of the most commonly diagnosed neurodevelopmental conditions. But here's the thing. This isn't just better awareness or improved diagnostic tools. Something deeper is happening. When a diagnosis becomes this common, we have to ask, are we facing an epidemic of disordered brains or an epidemic of unmet emotional needs in overstimulated environments?
It's a good question.
Yeah. Well, let's break it down. Because from a neuroscience standpoint, ADHD is a regulation issue. It's about how the brain filters information, balances dopamine, and handles attention. So the rise in ADHD mirrors the rise in chronic stress, emotional neglect, and nervous system overwhelm. So, it makes sense to consider what's changed in the last few decades. For instance, children are spending less time in nature and more time on screens.
Yes.
As adults are as well, right? Families are more fragmented and there's a less co-regulation happening and a lot more dissociation because parents are on screens a lot as well. Parents are working. Now, for the first time ever, since the beginning of working, you literally bring your work home with you on a laptop, on your phone. I'm like phone now. This is not the way we do phones anymore. This is the way we do phones. But so there's more. What's happening for little people is they only co-regulate, but they're co-regulating with adults who are mirroring dissociation. So that's going to be a huge factor. If we go into schools, right? Schools prioritize compliance over curiosity. And that forces kids into behavioral boxes. And both adults and children are being asked to perform produce, focus in increasingly overstimulating environments. And they have not been given the internal tools to manage it.
Right.
So maybe the spike in ADHD isn't a mystery. Maybe it's the body's completely appropriate response to a world that demands too much, too fast, and with too little safety, too little connection. If that's true, then we're not just talking about a mental health issue. Then we're talking about a cultural, emotional, and neurological reckoning. And recently, according to a government health site, they say that ADHD is the most common pediatric neurodevelopmental disorder diagnosed in the US.
That's wild. Okay, so
I mean, we're hearing it all around, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not shocking, but it's wild.
Well, we're hearing ADHD on the rise. We're hearing everybody's doing it, and there's channels about it and TikToks about it. And I mean, there's so much about it. So it's not surprising that we're going to be talking about ADHD, but.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, in Mind Change, clearly, as we do with pretty much anything else, we take a little bit of a different approach for really what ADHD is. And as you said at the beginning, we don't necessarily see it as a disorder, right? But as an adaptive brain response. And this response is to whether it's, early emotional or environmental stress, like you're talking about the different fragments of family and life and school and lots of different things, right? It's very different. So what are some of the, let's call them core subconscious drivers that create ADHD-like behavior?
Okay, so ADHD-like symptoms often emerge not from pathology, but from the brain adapting to early unresolved stress.
Okay.
So a child learns to monitor their environment intensely.
And this is obviously subconsciously, like they're not like, let me monitor the environment. What's happening? This is how they're intaking the world.
Yes. If in that monitoring of, remember, because everything we do is a skill, children have to learn everything.
Yep.
So they're monitoring their environment. If what they're finding is dissociation or dysregulation, then they're going to more intensely, more deeply, more critically monitor that environment.
Okay.
Now, a word we could use for that is hyper-vigilance. Okay. So when you've got someone that's sort of existing in hyper-vigilance, their system is in a chronic state of hypervigilance,
right? It's
right?
checking everything all the time.
Yes.
It's not necessarily singular focus. It's like this.
That causes overwhelm to the system. That reflects as danger. And so the system is like danger, 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 kind of on a low level, just as their regular way of being. Okay. So then they're already kind of at almost max capacity. Now, obviously, if we're talking about very traumatic situations and like traumatic neglect or abuse or something, those kids' wiring network for safety and danger or for danger are at max capacity and over already. But let's just say in kind of a normal family where we've got the parents are dissociated, busy, checked out, on their phones, not really, or just themselves did not learn emotional regulation.
So the majority of the world today.
Basically.
Yeah.
These kids become hypervigilant and then they are looking to escape any additional overwhelm. Okay. And a word that we use for that in ADHD languaging is impulsivity, right? So they are, when anything sort of starts to reach max, they will impulsively try to shift, change, get out of what feels like they're about to hit or go over max capacity. Okay. But they're not doing this consciously. This is all very subconscious nervous system kind of reaction.
And that could range, right? Like it can, the whole idea of like, for a child, what is maximum capacity for one child could be like hitting the roof. And for the other child, it's like minimal.
Yes.
For the same thing. So again, it's not like when this happens, that it could be a variation of things, and it could fire on all levels for different kids.
Right. So then you've got, okay, so let's say, as using your example, you've got impulsivity as one action resulting from that max capacity. Well, on the other side of that, you might have a child who becomes, they won't focus. It's like they won't focus on anything important.
Because?
Now, of course, what's important, it is what the parent is deeming important or the school is deeming important. And the child won't seem to be able to focus on those things, but they may be hyper-focused on something else they're doing. So they may be hyper-focused on a video game or a TV show or a drawing that they're doing. And so, see, these children can focus, but they're focusing on something that is stimulating their nervous system differently than what feels like it might be overwhelming. From a subconscious standpoint, those behaviors are protective in nature. So we see them as, or adults see them as, or adults who are doing ADHD see this as, this is a problematic behavior or a dysfunctional behavior. But really, it's a protective mechanism. These impulsivity, lack of focus, or hyper focus, or the, all of the different things, the massive activity, the hyper-vigilance, all of these various things, they're trying to protect the body from something else. Mm-hmm. For instance, oftentimes they are trying to protect from emotional neglect or rejection.
Okay.
Right. So, and this can come from, obviously we have extreme neglect, but a dissociated parent, a distracted parent is one of the most basic forms of emotional neglect. And so the child doesn't make, it's not as bad if I was being completely neglected. If their system feels neglected, it clocks it as neglect. They're not reasoning through, well, what is my neglect versus someone else's neglect?
Right.
So emotional neglect is what the maybe let's say hyperactivity is trying to deal with, because emotional neglect equals rejection. So for these kids, what they do is, if I keep moving, I won't feel the pain. I won't notice, right? They're having mirrored dissociation, distraction. So what do? They learn that behavior and to avoid, and then they'll keep doing it, but they'll do it kind of in excess. So that makes very much sense that the hyperactivity is keep moving, the hypervigilance, keep moving, I won't feel the pain.
And whether that's keep moving physically or whether that's keep moving mentally or whatever, right? Yeah.
And that can also be in like a high conflict kind of home life situation or a chaotic environment. If there is high conflict, so a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing, or even a lot of ignoring or icing someone out, that kind of thing, however the family handles conflict, then the child will learn by watching and by mirroring that it's safer to be distracted than to be present. If they don't see adults mirroring and modeling for them healthy conflict resolution, then they learn that it's safer to distract than to be in their bodies, to be present. So that's a very common example or symptom of what we might call ADHD, right? Okay. So then we have something like this suppressed creativity or autonomy. You've got these kids that it looks like they're just doing what they want to do, right? And it's like they're forcing autonomy or suppressing being able to be flexible and do all these other things. They get very hyper-focused on what they want. And it looks like they're ignoring or can't focus, can't listen, can't pay attention. But what really they're modeling is, my mind goes where it wants because the world doesn't let me. So it's really the only place that they find sovereignty, agency is in their own mind. So oftentimes they get very invested in whatever other world that they are in their heads, because it feels like their environments are restrictive, constrictive.
Okay, really quick, just for those listening. So this is this is very subconscious. This is very, like, in one sense, autonomic of what's happening in their system.
Yes.
Right? This isn't like, oh, the world is telling me this. I don't want to do this. Right? So that's just very important. That no one's thinking about this. No one's purposefully this plus this equals that. It just happens.
This is the beginning of a dysregulated nervous system as a norm.
Okay.
And that's how this happens, is by mirroring, matching, modeling early childhood environments, right? So in essence, these patterns that we see that we're calling symptoms of ADHD are survival strategies that get encoded by a dysregulated nervous system. So they're not signs of a broken brain. And some really great supporting research on this. Dr. Gabor Mate, the book Scattered Minds, describes ADHD as a response to emotional disconnection and misattunement in early development.
Can you describe what misattunement is?
Right. It's really misattuning to, or not being tuned into, our natural cadence of a healthy regulated nervous system. So there's a misattunement, meaning we're more co-regulating and tuning into adults who are dysregulated.
Yeah. Okay. So we are attuning, just not correct. So it's sort of like, if you were playing a guitar or something and it's like, oh, it's all tuned up, but it's tuned up a half step too high or a half step too low. You're joining everyone else, the world, and it sounds completely off, even though in your world, it's like when I play alone, when I'm in my mind a little, like everything's working fine, everything sounds fine. But then when you bring it to the rest of the world, it's out of alignment.
Sure. A great example, even take a symphony. Symphony is even more maybe applicable because you've got children trying to join into an already established thing that's happening. And then you've got the conductor or your leads of each.
Yeah, your first chairs.
Right. We always hear this is like, and we hear a note given, right? That note is the note that everyone's tuning to. If that note is off, you got a lot of people tuning in to off notes. Now, in a symphony, you've got people who really, 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 really know their music, know their instrument. Children don't yet.
Right.
They don't. They hear the note. They're like, great, we're on this note. And they just attune to that. And then we wonder why their behaviors are so out of tune.
Right.
Because they're attuned to something that's already out of tune. And adults make it work because that's their coping mechanism.
Right. So like if a child is attuning to an adult who is like, maybe not that whole example you were saying of like mirroring and showing and this is how to be healthy. Like if a child does that to and mirrors an adult in that way, they're going to grow up with this misattunement, right? But an adult knows how to, even when they're like wired in all sorts of ways, like they know how to sort of get in there and create what seems normal, or at least cover it up.
Less and less and less these days.
Auto tuning, like it's like.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's so much of what we're seeing is it's hit max capacity as a society as well. This is why you've got people freaking out on airplanes and people attacking each other and neighbors it's Karens, all the different things. We've hit max capacity a long time ago as a society, as a people, as a human race. And so, of course, adults aren't doing it very well either these days.
Okay.
Another thing is, I talk about this in the book, Mind Change, but the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study, they very clearly link childhood adversity to later on there being attention and behavioral difficulties.
Okay.
So, there you go.
Okay. So with all that you're saying, I have heard, and maybe people have probably, that ADHD can often be genetic. But what I'm hearing you say ultimately is that it seems to be more adaptive rather than genetic. It seems to be having a lot to do with environment and family dynamics. So is that true?
This is where this whole talk around genetics gets interesting, because it is being passed down, but more through a child's environment and family dynamics. So ADHD symptoms are linked to dysregulation of the nervous system and how emotional memory networks form in childhood. And those can hijack attention pathways. So ADHD at its core, like we said before, is a regulation issue. It's not just a lack of concentration issue. Because chronic nervous system dysregulation, especially when it's linked to early emotional neglect, overstimulation, or inconsistent caregiving, that can alter the development of the brain's default mode network, which is called the DMN, and their salience network. Okay. And both of those are critical to focus and task switching. Trauma or misattunement in early life leads to the subconscious prioritizing threat monitoring over presence, over being safe in one's own body. And the emotional memory networks, especially unresolved ones, those will then hijack conscious attention because the brain treats those imprints as more urgent than present moment. So what we're calling lack of attention is actually just the brain saying, we've got some really foundational things here that have not been resolved. It's still in threat mode.
And because of that, it's not so much that they can't focus on this or that, but it's more what I'm hearing is a lack of safety in being present.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And instead of being taught how to, or attention being brought to, hey, tuning in, right? How do you talk to ADHD kids? Hey, focus, look at me, outside, listen, do this thing. It's outside of them. So that's a bit of the problem.
Even doing certain things to like in one sense, here, do this practice, do this thing habitually so that you can learn to focus on one thing, right? There's like different things that doctors or therapists will kind of give people who are doing ADHD, right? Of like, okay, do this over and over and over and it helps you focus. But that might help them focus on a task, but it kind of bypasses the underlying root of the lack of safety.
And this is what compounds this, is that the child is being asked by the adult to do these things differently and adults usually aren't handling it in the most regulated fashion. Mm-hmm. Come on, focus. And why do you keep forgetting these things? And why can't you this? And why don't you just this? Or a lot of adults are doing ADHD as well. And so the story just becomes, we can't focus and we're just forgetful and we've got goblins in the brain and all these various things. And so instead of being taught how to tune in or for it to be modeled how to tune in, the ADHD brain is constantly trying to tune out because that's what it's taught to do. Tune out. It's searching for safety, stimulation, or escape, right? And a really great research support for this is Bessel van der Kolk and his wonderful work, The Body Keeps Score. And he really highlights how trauma rewires our attention systems to default towards survival, not engagement.
Okay.
And when especially children are in constant survival, the limbic system becomes hyperactive or hyper-reactive. So remember we talked about the ACEs score before,
right.
The ACEs adverse childhood experiences. In those people with high ACE scores, that actually mimics ADHD.
So, okay. I know that we talk about dopamine often and how it's brought up when talking about ADHD. Like this is a hot topic there. What's the relationship between dopamine, novelty seeking, and unmet needs for connection, safety in the ADHD brain?
Yeah, great question. And of course, dopamine is a major part of this conversation. So ADHD brains are often described as having low dopamine tone. But what if the core issue is...
Before you answer that, can you describe to our listeners what is low dopamine tone?
It's like a misalignment, or it's like their dopamine system isn't working well.
How?
They get spikes where they shouldn't get spikes. They don't get enough where they should be getting enough. I mean, it's
like not firing on all four cylinders, or even it's misfiring.
To some degree, yes. It gets very, very clinical and complicated. A great recommendation to understand dopamine and how the brain and body work with dopamine, Dopamine Nation, book called Dopamine Nation. Really wonderful to give you, it gives you some clinical and anatomical understandings, but it's actually a fairly easy read, I would say, for most people.
Okay.
That will really help people understand our relationship to dopamine and its relationship to ADHD. Also, Gabor Mate does talk about that in Scattered Minds as well.
Okay. Thank you for answering that. So go back to, you were talking about the core issue is...
So we're making it about dopamine, but listen, the dopamine system doesn't go offline for no reason. And I'm not saying it goes completely offline. It just starts to work differently than it was meant to or intended to work.
Okay.
What if it's more about chronic emotional undernourishment? So stick with me on this. What if children who lacked, let's say, consistent attention, good co-regulation, or healthy emotional stimulation, they will often develop this kind of dopamine hunger.
Okay.
So that's that crave for dopamine, because they're not getting it from some of the normal places that they would be getting it, which trains the dopamine system. Okay. So they learn that in order to get connection, they have to do something more. So let's say to get that hit of dopamine that they would have maybe gotten in these other regulated, having their brain stimulated by purpose and learning and engagement, they're going to be novel. So that thing that you spoke about earlier, novelty seeking, like constantly looking for new ways of thinking through things or doing things, right?
It's like the new show, the new this and the new that. It's like something that's giving them another hit.
Oh, and you'll hear but I'm bored. Like being bored is the worst possible thing to ever be able to happen to someone who's doing ADHD. But it's not really bored. It's not getting their dopamine that they're referring to. They don't realize that.
This is the low tone that you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so they seek novelty because they're looking for artificial hits of dopamine.
Okay.
These people almost may also be loud, like extra loud, a little like louder than maybe seems appropriate.
Because
that also
creates a spike.
And this is unfortunate, but it's the cycle. It also spikes something in usually the adults or the other people around them. So this is one of those kind of a negative attention. It still gets you what gets you your hit, gets the attention, right? If you're chronically undernourished for attention, for your needs being met, you're going to get them met. A child's going to get them met somehow. It's going to figure out a way to do it. So one of those options is to be loud, to be disruptive.
Okay. And in the ADHD brain, the whole idea here is like the reason or need for loud, novelty, all these things, is to be able to reach those dopamine hits because of the low tone dopamine, all of those different things.
Yes.
Okay.
These kids also, and we're not just talking about kids, this stuff follows into adulthood.
Sure,
this is kind of the genesis of this. You'll see them get funny. They'll be really funny. And they'll be funny because that mimics connection. If people laugh sometimes at them, but with them, then they feel that's almost, now a dopamine spike happens, and probably oxytocin, but it's being done in one sense synthetically, because then you have to stay funny. You don't realize it's the connection you're seeking. You think that it's the funny that gets you this, but funny often is what people are trying to connect with.
Okay.
They become also fast moving often, like really, it seems like maybe erratic in the way that their body is going. Remember, because presence, stillness, doesn't actually feel safe. So we think these kids just can't hold still. It's really a safety. To sit still means they're going to have to deal with the level of threat that keeps popping up. So they're moving away from the feeling of threat that arises in their bodies if they hold still. And so again, that feeds into the novelty seeking, because it becomes kind of like their nervous system's way of finding that safety, attention, or soothing. So the dopamine seeking isn't dysfunctional, it's compensatory.
Meaning?
Seeking dopamine is a natural part of being human.
Yeah.
We need dopamine.
Yeah, whether that's like pleasure or whether that's like whatever it is, there's goodness in dopamine is something that is a nourishment.
For something to become compensatory, it means we're compensating for a lack of. So that it reflects a lack of relational connection or internal connection or internal aliveness that the child didn't get early on. And another great bit of support for this research, Dan Siegel, he's the author of The Whole Brain Child. And he shows that dopamine is deeply tied, not just to pleasure. That's what we hear a lot of. Dopamine is pleasure seeking, but it's really more about attachment and bonding that we're seeking rather than pleasure. Pleasure becomes the compensatory mechanism there.
Okay.
So pleasure seeking gets you dopamine, but it's kind of getting that like artificial hit. It's like fake sugar versus us getting sugars, from our fruits and everything like that. It gives you the high, but you come down from it quicker.
Right. It's like social media, like real. Like we get this idea of like connecting with the world, but we're actually not. And it's artificial spikes of dopamine. Okay. So then can you explain how early attachment patterns for a child, for a human, and developmental trauma, so these are things that are happening, throughout their life, influence in ADHD brains' executive function, their attention, and the impulse to control through brain development?
Okay, so going to get just a smidge into brain function and science here. So the prefrontal cortex, right behind here, is the seat of where we do all of our planning, impulse control, focused attention. And it is primarily developed in response to safe, attuned to a regulated nervous system, but attuned caregiving.
Okay.
So prefrontal cortex development starts to become a little bit more online. I mean, it's always happening, but it starts to become a little bit more online around 11. So interesting. There's a lot of diagnosis happening around that age. And the prefrontal cortex grows in relation to those safe, secure attachments.
I also might add that years and years ago, it was like you reach a certain age and now you need to be an adult. You need to be this, like that. But it's becoming over the last couple of decades, a lot more like, no, at this age, earlier, you need to be this, you need to be that. So it's almost like suppressing it and pushing them to be children to be a certain way even earlier, which is possibly why even there's now earlier diagnoses of like, oh, they're not sitting still, they're not right, all of these different things. So,
well, it actually damages prefrontal cortex development when they're being asked to hold more adult situations and concepts at a younger age. So all that they're being exposed to through social media and television and parents' dysregulation and the violence that is on the news, the way the news favors conflict, and it's actually damaging to prefrontal cortex development.
And not letting their brain develop naturally through play, through all the different things that they should be doing with their body and with their life, because now from age 4, they're needing to sit still.
Yes. And so, I mean, back to like talking about attachment stuff. So insecure or disorganized attachment, and that's attachment theory and often the result of emotionally inconsistent or frightening parenting, can lead to underdeveloped executive function. That's one of the huge things we talk about in brain development. And a lot of adults are dealing with this now. A lot of conversation around neurodivergence and that being an executive function issue. And what we're talking about there is just, it's prefrontal cortex not functioning to the degree in which it should be functioning. And so we also see a fragmented sense of self. More than ever before, I've heard people talk about dissociation, people dissociating, having dissociative episodes. And that is that fragmented sense of self. They're learning it early. And then those people are having children. They grow up, they're still fragmented. They're still underdeveloped in their executive function. They're having children, and those children are regulating to dysregulation. So we're just seeing generations of poor emotional regulation. And these children will often show externalizing behaviors like distractibility, impulsivity, internalizing, that looks like daydreaming or sometimes emotional collapse, like when you see these kids melt down. So why is this happening? Because in chaos, the brain develops for speed, survival, not focus, reflection, sitting still, learning. That's not what the brain is being told to develop into when there's chaos all around us. Right. The Harvard Center on Developing Child, it links toxic stress to that delayed prefrontal development that I'm talking about. And then another really great resource is Dr. Alan Shore. He is a clinician and psychoanalyst, and he's like the world expert in how childhood attachment patterns impact adult relationships. And he has shown that early emotional experiences, like we're talking about, actually wire the brain's ability to regulate attention impulses long before behavior is learned. So that's like, we're expecting these kids to be able to sit in schools and listen the way that they're supposed to listen and do these things the way that they're supposed to do that. But to do that, they should be coming into those situations having already learned some of the building blocks to support that desired behavior. That's not happening.
Okay. So like if you could then compare, let's say brain scans. So if you could compare brain scans and emotional drivers, which we talk about all the time, of someone with ADHD and someone with PTSD, what would we find? Like, would there be similarities? Would there be overlap?
Well, this is where some of the great research is helping at least inform me to feel like, hey, this is something else going on here than just a disordered brain for the sake of, oh, I was born this way. So yes, as a matter of fact, there has been specific brain imaging done. So of course they've imaged ADHD brains And of course, we've imaged PTSD brains. What not many people have done, but now has been done, is to watch where that overlaps. And they are very similar. So you're going to see an enlarged amygdala, right? The amygdala is because there's a heightened fear response. It's the fight, flight, or freeze, fawn kind of mechanism, right? You're going to see in both PTSD and ADHD, underactive prefrontal cortex. That's going to lead to poor impulse control, poor attention. You're going to see decreased hippocampal volume. So not as much volume in the hippocampus. And that's where disordered memory processing comes from.
Which I will say is kind of cool that, what we talk about often here at Mind Change are like things that happen emotionally and relationally and all of this, but it's because everything that we do here at Mind Change is neuroscience based. I love that you're bringing in, here's what's actually happening in the brain with these things.
That's why Mind Change works, is because we deal with the knowledge that this is how this stuff forms. And so we're getting to the root of it rather than treating symptoms down the line.
Yeah, the symptoms aren't, or even let's say the way that these brains are scanned, like that's not the problem. It is the outcome. And so if we know how it was developed, you get in there and yeah.
So we talk about in Mind Change rumination, right? I talk a lot about rumination in the book, Mind Change. And interestingly enough, these scans in PTSD as well as ADHD show there's an altered connectivity in the DMN. That's again, the default mode network. And that is shown to cause rumination, dissociation, and that whole problem with task switching. It's like task switching feels dangerous, not just like overwhelming or, I don't want to right now. It feels like a threat to the very survival of this type of brain. We also see that there's emotional driver overlap, right? So I love me an emotional driver. And so if we go through the emotional drivers of certain PTSDs, even complex and especially complex PTSD and ADHD, we're going to see that both populations often experience what we call emotional flooding. So, it's the overwhelm of, it feels like you're being taken away by or by emotions rather than this is something I just created and can process through.
Right.
They also have poor self-trust and that thing we talked about earlier, that kind of fragmentation of identity. And so some of the core beliefs that contribute to this is first and foremost, I'm not safe, right? Because we have at the most base level, a safety mechanism issue, right? A safety regulation issue.
So they're living out of these core beliefs or these core drivers.
And this is not what they're saying consciously. This is what the subconscious thought process goes through because of what the body is doing.
Which then, again, 99% of all of our what we do, feel, think, believe is from that subconscious place. So if it's, I'm not safe, even if they're not thinking that, they will live from a place, act out of a place, feel at a place of, I'm not safe.
Yes. These people also typically feel like I'm not in control. Life is happening to them rather than they are participating in life. So they get this kind of I need to act fast. I need to act fast. I need to do it fast. I need to do it quick. Or on the other side of that kind of hyper focus so that they get some piece of their mind and body to quiet down. Now, ideally, we'd like to do that through presence and breath and connection with nature and the choice. They feel like they don't have much choice. So hyper focus keeps them from feeling all the other feels, dealing with all the other deals. They just hyper focus. And so from the outside, it looks like they're being disobedient or they're being rebellious or they're being sometimes even lazy or defiant because they are doing something really to a very hyperactive degree. And we're thinking that that's problematic, where for them, it's solving a problem. So then again, now we've got a massive dissociation from reality, because you've got the adults, the figures in your life who are the authority figures, saying that there's something wrong with you. And if we could hear your sweet little subconscious mind and body go, something wrong. This is the only thing that feels right. I'm doing this because it's the only thing that feels good. And you're telling me it's wrong. But that's problematic.
And then what does that do to the system? How does that reinforce what's going on already?
Well, I mean, what's labeled as attention deficit in ADHD is actually just the nervous system creating safety. And so, but then we're being told that that's not safe. That's traumatic.
Okay.
In fact, it can be like complex trauma, that the thing that you were doing to keep you safe created more danger for you. And so you're stuck. That feels very dangerous, feels very stuck.
So you've mentioned, and of course we talk about everything that you do is a skill, right? Everything we learn, everything that we do, everything that we think, it ends up becoming a skill. So you mentioned that ADHD is more likely a skill that the brain learns as a way to ultimately cope, right? So can you go into that a little bit more? Maybe give us like a metaphor, or your favorite thing to do, which you do in daily life with me, with the kids, with everything else. But a little bit, just to help us understand how ADHD might be like a subconscious strategy. Of course, we're talking about how this is like the driver. This is the core, but a strategy to survive this chaos you're talking about that is perceived, that is felt, that whether it's boredom, the chaos or pressure or novelty, like seeking, all of these different things.
I thought you'd never ask. Instead of one metaphor, I'll give you three.
Okay. I only asked for one.
I know. Well, I'm going to give you three. Because some people will really resonate with the brain science, and other people will be like, just tell me what the heck you're talking about. So I'll make them very basic.
Okay.
How about the smoke alarm, the fire alarm that won't shut off? So you can imagine growing up in a house where there's constant, let's say, little fires. Right? There's conflict, there's unpredictability, there's emotional volatility, and your brain, as it should, this is very normal for children, and it's normal for adults too, is we're constantly scanning and seeking safety, right? Where am I in relation to my environment? So then that little brain becomes like a smoke alarm. It's always scanning, always listening, always looking for threat. And it wants to. Remember, fires are painful. Fires are scary. So our brain is a energy saving machine. So it's like, what comes before fire? Smoke. Let's start looking for even smoke as a protective mechanism. Now, even when the house is calm, that alarm goes off because, wait, this is not normal. Calm feels not normal. And so remember, it's looking for smoke. And anything not normal feels dangerous. So then it's like, uh-oh. Then something happens, as it inevitably does in chaotic homes. And then that's the fire. And so the brain goes, yep, see, I knew it. And then now you're in full alarm.
So it's like always going on rather than even in states of calm. Like it's actually not calm.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's what distractibility or reactivity can be.
Okay.
Is that hyper-vigilant system, and you never get the message. So we see ADHD in adults, and that's because the message never comes through. You're safe.
Even in the calm, because that's the whole smoke thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's one maybe metaphor for that.
Okay. Give me another.
Okay. A tornado of too much. Okay. So picture a child who is a deep, creative, feeling-based kind of child, right? They have a rich inner world, inner production. And they're trying to survive in a rigid, rule-based, performance-focused environment. And so for them to cope, they spin like a tornado, literally. They their energy feels so big, right? They're meant to be the inspirers, the creatives, the really big feelers. And then they're in this very constricted space. So what do they do with that energy? It starts to scatter in every direction. So they move, they talk, they react, they forget. They're like blah, 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 all the time, right? Not because they don't care, but because that stillness becomes associated with the performance, the right way to do things. And that's stifling their creativity. But then when they come outside of that, then they get shame or failure or criticizing, right? So the tornado becomes a strategy to stay ahead of all of the things that come with staying still, right? So these are the, you were too much, you were too difficult, you would never shut up, you'd never stop talking, you'd never sit still, you would never, because they're like bing bonging with energy. So they're called hyperactive, but they're just not being given the space to contain all of the very big ideas. So
it's like they're being like squashed, and then it's because they're not able to express, feel, move, whatever, because of that lack of safety in doing that, it's a constant pressure cooker of whatever, and then that tornado is just going off.
Yes.
Okay.
And another one we'll call the runaway train. Okay, so this is a situation when you've got a child who maybe never learns how to regulate their own emotional breaks, likely because they have an adult in their life, a caregiver who has a difficult time regulating their own emotions. So they may get very, very angry. They may get very, very anxious, very worried, very all the time. And they get sort of taken by emotions, these adults. So then the child doesn't learn how to put brakes on their own emotions, how to feel the feeling but not become the emotion, right? So that way, every thought, feeling, or distraction turns into momentum because they're not putting the brakes on it. So it becomes bigger and it becomes bigger and it becomes bigger, and they're not watching. And so they've watched, well, dad yells, mom becomes really anxious and worried. Those don't seem like options. They don't like that. So those don't seem like options. They don't know how to find an outlet for all that's happening in them. So they become this like runaway train. And then they can't focus on little things around them. So tasks, basic tasks, brushing one's teeth, cleaning one's room, picking up one's stuff, doing their homework, all of those things, they're abandoned.
Yeah, who cares? You got this runaway train. Like, those things are unimportant. I mean, for their nervous system, for their brain, for their life.
They feel unimportant. They really do.
Yeah.
But because the brain doesn't know how to slow down, it only knows how to jump tracks.
Okay.
Right? What do you do with a runaway train? You divert it on another track, right? And so that's what happens. They jump track, jump track, jump track, jump track. And so their impulse control becomes less about willpower and more about missing that kind of inner conductor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I like the third one.
Did you like the third one? Does that feel relevant?
Yeah.
Well, how about a story then? I'll just tell you a little story also. Okay. Kind of a child developing ADHD symptoms based on emotional misattunement or school pressure or that kind of lack of agency that we've talked about, lack of sovereignty, and how that gets wired into the brain. So we're gonna take a little boy. We're gonna call him Eli. Okay. So we're gonna say Eli is wildly imaginative. He's 7 years old, and he's got that rich inner production that we're talking about. Like, he can go completely into other worlds and really be there and really experience that and feel that. And he loves things like dinosaurs and drawing things and making pictures and maps and building things. Like, a box becomes a spaceship, right? That kind of a kid. But at home, his parents are always fighting. At school, he keeps being told, sit still, or by his peers, like, stop being weird. You're so weird, right? And every time Eli kind of lets out this creativity and shows his real self, he gets met with conflict or correction. So Eli's little brain makes a choice, subconsciously, not consciously. When things get overwhelming, and what's going to be overwhelming for Eli? Probably quite a bit, because he hasn't learned emotional regulation. So remember, he's that kid we were talking about in the very beginning that is almost at max capacity all of the time. Probably the only time Eli feels like he's outside of max capacity is when he's in his own world.
Like when he's being creative, when he's being imaginative, and all of these different things.
And nobody's bothering him.
Right.
And nobody's asking him to come away from this place of control and safety. So for him, when things get overwhelming, he tunes out, goes into his own little place, right? If things get too scary or too confusing or too demanding, which probably happens very quickly. It doesn't take much for that to happen to Eli, because he's in such a world of he's never okay. He's not okay at school. He's not okay at home. So then he does the thing of escaping into imagination. And likely, Eli's probably going to get into trouble. He's probably going to get into trouble at home, because for a family who might be fighting all the time, you don't want your kids to be extra. You want them to be easy. And this kid might feel extra. He might take 10 times to be told to do something when you would hope, well, the parents' hope is they do it without being asked, but he hasn't been trained how to have a brain like that. So then he goes to school, he gets in trouble. He's weird. He won't sit still. He won't finish his homework. He won't pay attention. And so he gets in trouble a lot. So his little brain goes, okay, I got to act fast and shift and shift and shift and jump tracks again and again and again, so that the shame and the feeling of like, oh my gosh, there must be something wrong with me. I don't fit in anywhere. Before that is sat in, you don't want to sit in that. He already knows that he doesn't want to sit in that. That feels too yucky, too big. It's still there. He just doesn't want to sit in it. So we get a lot of hyperactivity. So by age 10, you've got Eli. What is he being told? Probably to the parents by the school. The school is being like, hey, your kid's got ADHD. You should have him tested, because he doesn't fit into the school environment. Because we'll get into that a little bit later.
Who fits into the school environment?
Right? And he also isn't feeling really like safe or accepted or normal at home. And so now we've got a label. ADHD is the answer. But his symptoms were never random. They were never wrong. In fact, it was his brain's way of custom building a defense system, a strategy for surviving in a world that didn't feel safe and also doesn't allow his full presence. With mind change, Eli doesn't need to be fixed. He needs to be heard. He needs to be taught and rewired for survival in safety, in rest, so that he can finally utilize all that creativity, all of that wild imagination for thriving rather than surviving.
Yeah.
So ADHD isn't a character flaw. It's not a brain flaw or a disorder. It's not a lack of motivation. It's a nervous system doing its best to adapt. Your brain isn't broken. It's actually brilliant. It's just that it learned to survive because it didn't feel safe.
Okay, so you're talking about this school story. And for me, when I work with clients, yes, there are things that we work through, whether that's, grief or loss of a loved one as an adult, or perhaps it's something traumatic that happened as an adult, or this thing they're going through. We'll work through all that. But the majority of at least the root of where these things developed, whatever we're working on, phobias, fears, addictions, problems, whatever, typically are from childhood, school age, like times in their life, right?
And not just families.
Right.
A lot of school stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And so like it's interesting because I'll have people, write things down on their pain cure and things like that. And it's like, yeah, they'll put their age or whatever, but it's like 3rd grade, this happened, 5th grade, this happened, 7th grade. Like it's very often things in school that happen. So all that to be said, with that kind of environment, can you talk a little bit about, I say our educational system. I mean, every country has a little different, but ultimately the educational system since the Industrial Revolution, okay, and how it's sort of been since then. Can you talk about how that system actually reinforces, maybe even helps create ADHD brains, ADHD patterns?
Absolutely. And we hear this. I've talked to so many parents who the first idea of ADHD came from the school. ADHD symptoms don't emerge in a vacuum. They often flourish in environments where like creativity is limited or movement is discouraged or curiosity is replaced by compliance. And unfortunately, for many children, that description fits the modern school system. So our school system is built for uniformity, not neurodiversity. Now, when I'm talking about neurodiversity, I'm talking about not as this is a problem or having a neurodiverse. I think we all have neurodiverse brains. We weren't all meant to be taught the same way or taught the same stuff. No way.
No, I mean, neurodiversity, thinking differently. it's like we
so
are different
good.
in our, yeah.
Yes. Schools are designed around, like you mentioned, industrial age principles. So they value standardization, efficiency, and control.
Yeah, it's make a line, do your thing, pass it on.
Yes, that's valued, highly valued. Children are expected to sit still for 6 to 8 hours. They're expected to follow auditory instructions. So do as I say. I'm not going to show you. I'm not going to model it for you. You do as I say. And then complete repetitive tasks over and over again.
Now, I will say, just for those of you who are like, no, like whether you're a teacher, which granted, I was a teacher. So, okay, I'm just going to put that out there. It wasn't like.
Yes, you taught.
I taught.
Yeah.
I taught in elementary schools. And so, but what I want to say is, yes, in today's age, we do have a lot more visual things as well, right? Drawing on the board and projectors and all of that. And yet it still comes back to I'm explaining this thing, right? And then you're expected to just get it in a certain way.
Yeah.
So anyways.
Yeah. And you're expected to do it being quiet, polite, and compliant. And so you're there 8 hours to do all this.
And you got like 20, 30 kids in the class with one adult. It's like, come on.
Oh, yeah. And then you're also expected to even take school back home with you and keep further control of the children's time and attention through homework. But for a child, they're wired for kinesthetic learning, touch learning. They need to touch things. They need to be touched. That's not in school. It's not helping. When it happens in school, it's usually unhealthy, but they're meant for that, right? Emotional expression, imaginative processing. And so these school environments become a real internal battle. So the kids aren't unfocused. They're just unengaged. They're not being engaged.
I mean, they're being engaged, but they're being engaged the way that the adult wants to engage with them rather than the way they need to be engaged with.
Yes. And so their brain is protecting them from boredom, shame, restriction. So it's seeking stimulation. And unfortunately, how we're seeing that all around. How is it being stimulated? Well, remember we talked about that novelty seeking,
Right.
and how that can be done by being loud, by being, rebellious and all these things. So we're just seeing this is the school classroom. They're seeking novelty because their brains are not being engaged and stimulated in a healthy way. So because today's school systems, it's behavioral compliance is of greater value than emotional safety. See, they think that the way to provide emotional safety is by getting everyone to behaviorally comply, but in the way of the industrial teaching.
Right. Like, and things have shifted more for the positive, where like, instead of just getting your name on the board or just getting in trouble for this or that, things are, and I remember even way back in the day, like being taught, hey, now let's do some more reward-based behavioral training, right? Of like, instead of if you do this, you're going to have detention, it was if you do this, you're going to get some kind of, I don't know, novelty, right? Something good, which did help to a degree because it allows them to use, oh, what am I going to get? And what is this? But it still is trying to get them or force them to get into this box of be this way.
Well, that's teaching their nervous system, their dopamine hits to come synthetically from, quick reward is the only way I'm actually going to sit here and stay and listen.
Yeah, I had this whole system where it was like, there's like this long reward if the whole class like adds all of these, I think it was like marbles or something up to a certain point. But then marbles are going to be taken out as well, but it was like the whole class one, but then individual rewards. But it was all, again, a reward system. It's dopamine.
Well, I mean, teachers are desperately under pressure from these overpacked classrooms of kids coming from dysregulated homes.
And I will say my classroom was definitely the loudest and the most like, let's just say I didn't love when the assistant principal would walk in at times to observe me, right? Because like kids are over here and over. Now we got our stuff down, but next door, my friend, neighbor, teacher, I would like put the smack down and her kids were quiet. But again, it was like, it had to do with getting them to be a certain way. And that's where the problems lie.
It's behavior management. It isn't teaching them emotional processing.
That is exactly why I quit, actually.
Yeah.
Is what I realized after getting my teaching degree and doing all of these things and doing the tests and the state tests, like I loved being with this age kids. And I realized after being there, I'm like, I hate teaching them the curriculum. Because I didn't believe in what I was doing, but what I did love was being with them and listening and helping them and all of that. And I was like, ooh, I'm in the wrong field here.
How sad, though.
I know.
That's what they need.
I know.
Right?
So anyways, yeah.
Well, I mean, the fidgeting kid, the kid who fidgets, like, they're punished. They're not asked what their body needs. And we may think that coming into school, they should have been taught to deal with what their body needs and communicate that. They're not being taught that at home. So we can't expect that to be what's happening in school. And plus that system isn't great anyway. Like, at what point in your whole entire journey as a human should you be ignoring what your body needs? You shouldn't, but we're reinforcing that, right? An inattentive child, they're labeled. They're given a label. They're given that kid, they don't pay attention. They don't care. They don't want to be here. All these different things. They're not empathized with. And this is not, I don't believe this is the teacher's fault. They're trying to just have somewhat of a relatively physically safe environment. They're not trying to focus on emotionally safe.
Well, they have the pressure on. It's pressure upon pressure upon pressure.
Yeah, the system's broken.
Yeah,
you can't. I feel like this is a whole other podcast
whatever,
episode, right? But here's the truth: like most ADHD behaviors, they're nervous system signals. They're not acts of defiance. When the environment punishes the signal, the body and the mind are going to double down on the behavior. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
In other words, what's seen as the problem is actually a protest. Children's brains are not usually more interest-based, or they are usually more interest-based than task-based.
So like, they're not necessarily protesting, I don't want to do this thing. It's protesting, I don't want to feel the way I'm feeling right now.
Yes.
And it comes out as I don't want to do this thing, or I'm going to act out or whatever. But really it's like, if we were to give the child what they needed at home, at school, at whatever, there would be just a different production of brains.
Right. And if we were engaging children in ways that helped them feel like what they're learning is meaningful, creative, or considering them as an emotional being as well, then I think we'd be seeing a different outcome. But most schools' content is delivered in these sort of disembodied ways, right? It's rote memorization. Teachers will even tell you, we teach what needs to be passed on the state school exams, right? So it's memorization. They're trying to get these kids to memorize enough information that it'll translate on these tests. And it's just isolated facts. And then they're taught to be given rewards. And so you're not doing it because you're interested in what you're learning. You don't care about what you're learning. You're trying to win the reward.
Or avoid the shame and the guilt.
Yes. And that is just,
punishment.
we're working in a different system.
Yeah.
And so then you've got these children with unresolved emotional pain, right? Or the ones that are creatively wired, and it just becomes intolerable to their systems. The system says, stay on track. The brain says, why? This doesn't matter to me. And so it looks like distractibility, defiance, or shutdown. It's not dysfunction. It's disconnect from doing anything meaningful.
And can I, for a moment, for those of you who are like, yeah, but what about your children in school? And all, like, we'll just say, I remember, our kids did a lot of different schooling, right? At the beginning, it was, kindergarten was homeschooled for one of ours. There was a lot of good reasons for that. And then we were like, all right, let's try the public system. That was very difficult for her, but she pushed through and she did really well. And then we ended up moving, and they tried Montessori, and then they have tried a lot of different things, like more alternative schooling. And then at one point in older elementary, it was like, okay, they're going to need to do public school. And they did. And they did fine in a lot of ways, but it was a battle for some of the things that you're talking about. Now, as they got older, they did, online schooling, homeschooling, different things like that. And then they decided in high school, like, we really want to try high school, because throughout all of middle school, they were homeschooled, and they were like, we really want to try it. And so they did. And we said, okay, great. We're going to move here. We're going to do this. We're going to put you in school. We trust you guys. You're going to do great. Da, da, da. Just a couple of months in, after a number of years of being more alternative school and homeschool, and here's your free time and do what you need to do, and then we're going to go out. It was like, go to school for 8 hours, come home, do 2 to 3 hours of homework. And they were like, what am I doing with my life? Of course, we weren't saying these things, but I was feeling definitely like, what are they doing with their life? And they made the choice to, no, I'm going to actually pull out of this. I'm going to do school the way I want to do school. And yet there's just certain things that, like, no, you got to do that class. You have to do this. And we're not hiding it from them. One of them just graduated and is going off to college. And, but the other one's like, why do I have to learn this and this? Why can't I learn this and meaningful? And we're like, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
And I will say both of them came out of school experiences with labels from other children.
And teachers.
Yeah. Of, you probably are ADHD, you're probably neurodivergent, you're probably, these things, these are the ways we're explaining why kids have a hard time, rather than being like, maybe they're having a hard time because the system, like, this is where oftentimes a lot of shame based conditioning starts. You know, they're told like, pay attention, stop daydreaming. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just sit still? And then they begin to learn how to be defined as good or bad by grades. And that's really difficult on the system.
They're already being defined by everything else. Now we're adding letters to it.
Right. And they're comparing. That's how that's what it says. You need to be this way. This is an A, this is an F. And it tries to pigeonhole everybody. And so they learn this comparison, and they learn to start thinking, well, if everybody's supposed to do this exact thing, what's wrong with me? And so that the subconscious internalizes the belief, things like, I'm too much. There's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm not good enough. And honestly, those beliefs are more damaging than any symptoms. And it lays the foundation for what we've talked about and what a lot of adults deal with, which is that emotional fragmentation, imposter syndrome, perfectionism, all of that happens. It's like the cycle is oftentimes they're not getting what they need at home. Then the child struggles at school. Then they get labeled at school. Then they feel defective. And then they develop coping patterns around being defective. And then that's reinforced by the environment. And it all just becomes an identity. And it's not that these children necessarily have ADHD. It's that they're not being seen for who they really are. And our education system was designed, like we've talked about, for the Industrial Revolution, to produce compliant workers, not self-aware humans.
And for the majority of the world, it is filled with workers, productive workers. Like that's really what most businesses are wanting. Like, I want a productive worker. Okay, so we've talked about a lot. All of these beliefs, they drive dysregulation, right? All of these things that are formed in childhood, school, like whatever it is, family, school, distractibility, impulsivity, not because of a child's character flaws, but because of the subconscious protection that you've been talking about over and over. It's just like, what is safe for them? What do they need? So how, and this is the big question that everyone wants to know, like, are there reprogramming strategies? Are there things that can be done? Because on one hand, it's like, great, let's give the child what they need from a young age so that they can grow up regulated, so that they can grow up mirroring what they're seeing healthy adults do and feel and all of that. Great. That's where we honestly want to start. But what about those who maybe missed that? So are there reprogramming strategies with mind change that can help someone who has been labeled ADHD, who has been all of these things you're talking about?
Luckily, yes.
Okay.
Through the mind change method, what we do is we go back and we identify those core memories, messages, or beliefs that were formed. We rewire those experiences and then update it with present day truth, safety, regulation. Once the nervous system learns that it's safe to slow down, I don't need to perform to be loved, then those other behaviors, they lose their functions.
But are you saying then that even though someone has lived a quote unquote ADHD brain for this amount of time, that it can actually rewire so that they don't, or they no longer produce the ADHD brain symptoms?
Yes, because the ADHD brain it's not like there's, oh, I've got ADHD brain, like my brain, there's something wrong with it. No, it formed in response to these early childhood learnings. If we go back and we rewire that different, it adapts very quickly to, okay, well then I'll use this hyperproductivity in a positive way. They don't become coping strategies. They become skills that you can implement when you feel like it.
Because it's not just about like, oh, I'm going to put this behavior in motion, or I'm going to just change the way I cognitively, consciously think about this. But you're saying that when you actually go in and rewire how let's just call it the ADHD symptoms were originally formed through these beliefs, through this lack of safety, through this whatever, right? All of these different things, that you can actually change tendencies like impulsivity, like shame spirals, like emotional flooding.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, we hear this a lot in the student community. There's a particular student I'm thinking of right now who has brought this up as a side effect of, I thought I was like severely ADHD, but what I realized was, various things through, it's not like this person worked on ADHD, or maybe she did, I don't really know, but it was kind of a side effect thing. But the mind change method, it works because we rewire the emotional charge and the neural pathway behind the thoughts, patterns, and reactions. We're not just managing behavior. In fact, that's how we got there in the first place. So we're not managing behavior. We are actually changing the messages from the brain, the way that it's stored, the way that they learned it, what they saw, what they heard, what they knew, what they felt. And then we're changing that to something different. And then the nervous system can calm down and regulate.
And it can change this dopamine low tone, and it can change all of these different neurotransmitters and things that are firing up because of outside stimuli. It changes how we are internalizing them.
Yeah. So like with impulsivity, what we'll do is we'll uncover the original like urgency pattern.
Right.
That often comes from environments where like expressions of oneself wasn't safe, various things like that, right? And we'll repattern that. And that allows clients to feel safe to pause, safe to be present, safe to have discernment, or to be slow and not cognitively slow, to slow their bodies down.
Yeah, everything in your brain slows down, which allows more presence, which allows, yeah.
And it's common in ADHD speak to say they spiral, right? So they spiral. That's that rumination thing. So it's very frequent for them to go into shame spirals. They carry so many layers of internalized failure because they didn't fit in, right? They were never doing it right or okay. So then we trace those emotional memories back to early school or family interactions, and we neutralize that emotional intensity. And then we help them rewrite from the perspective of truth rather than trauma. So yeah, so many different ways we take what the behavior is that is being seen as an ADHD symptom, sign, problem, and we rewire the fear-based response loop. So mind change offers not just coping, but resolution at the root. And not only that, but with some of the other core mind change principles and techniques, we're being intentional and purposeful about dealing with the dopamine cycle. So instead of denying the ADHD brain's need for stimulation, we learn to feed it on purpose, but through the ways that it gets actual dopamine, long-lasting signals rather than those quick hits. So to do that, we help link those dopamine spikes with things that are safe, connected, like presence and gratitude and all of that.
Okay. So I know that we work with a lot of people who do anxiety, a lot of people who do mental health disorders, and so forth. Do you, or maybe you could share a specific story about someone who's used these approaches, either a client or something like that, who really shifted the ADHD experience from chaos to calm?
Yes. For client confidentiality purposes, we're going to call this client Rachel.
Not her real name.
Not her real name.
Or his real name. We
exactly.
don't know.
And some of the details may have changed just for client confidentiality. But
okay.
Rachel will feel familiar to many people out there because Rachel was the burned out overachiever.
Okay.
So she came to us feeling like she was a failure, even though she was a very high achieving person. So she's highly intelligent, but couldn't finish projects or perceived she couldn't finish projects. She'd miss deadlines, and then that would lead into a cycle and she'd feel paralyzed by shame. So in dealing with this, she was diagnosed with ADHD. And at first, Rachel's like, oh, this is amazing. I'm so glad. It's such a relief because it validated so many of the things that she felt and the behaviors that she had struggled with since she was very young. So over time, like she gets diagnosed and then she goes through the whole medication cycle. And of course, like many mental health disorders, there's a lot of teeter-tottering with medications and different dosages. So she rode that whole wave for quite a long time. But over time, the medication started to come with unwanted side effects. She was feeling more disconnected, more sort of apathetic. And she had developed some kind of core identities about being ADHD and identities about herself. Of people, you can almost kind of hear the way that people talk about themselves. I'm like, oh, my ADHD makes me do this, and my ADHD makes me do that. And oh, because I have ADHD this, and because I have ADHD that, it becomes this kind of thing. And that was Rachel's case. It became like her excuse to explain every negative thought or behavior that she had. Unfortunately, those things kept getting worse and worse, though. So through mind change, she discovered a belief that she had absorbed as a child. And that belief was, you have to do everything perfectly or you'll be left behind. Now, did anyone ever specifically say that to her? No, but it is what her little brain absorbed. Yeah. And it was that decision that she subconsciously made as a child through a number of different childhood environments, right? So she grew up in a home where love felt conditional and like high achievement, high performance was valued. So that became her survival, trying to be good at everything. And right? So that led into these like ADHD symptoms, hyperfocus, overwhelm, emotional shutdown. And those weren't signs of dysfunction. They were signs of adaptation. She had what might be traditionally thought of, she hadn't had what we might traditionally think of as a traumatic childhood, right? Like a lot of people are like, well, I didn't really have a traumatic childhood. She didn't think so either. In fact, she felt pretty close to her parents and felt positively about the way that she grew up. But some of her own parents' unhealed trauma, for instance, her mother's anxiety and her father's perfectionism, and he was kind of a workaholic and kind of a performance strict guy, that resulted in them having very high standards put on her school performance. And that really contributed greatly to her needing to figure out a way to cope as a little person, right? That's a lot of pressure. If you have to be absolutely the best at everything you do, you have to focus on a lot of things all at once, all the time, right? So we found those things. We found the identities and some of the core situations that led to her having those kind of coping mechanisms and skills. And Rachel rewired those beliefs. And through that, she reconnected with that kind of playful, intuitive inner child. That allowed her to set new boundaries around time, creativity, and more importantly, rest. And so today, she no longer labels herself as ADHD, and she no longer takes any medication. That is not saying anything about those people out there doing ADHD and that are medicated. But for Rachel, she realized that she was kind of stuck in relying on the medication to keep her okay, keep her acceptable, keep her being able to do all these different things. She was outsourcing a lot of her power to medication. And so in her words, she feels sovereign now. Like ADHD no longer controls her life, her thoughts. She turned her coping mechanisms that were the former coping mechanisms into superpowers.
It's not who she is anymore. Yeah.
Right. And those things that used to be seen as problems, she now has as skills to be utilized, not to cope, but to like, oh, do I need to be really hyper-focused for this particular project? She can do that. But she can also stop, come out, rest, play, get creative, do those different things. The task switching, all the different things that she thought were problems before, she now has in her tool belt to pull out if the environment or the situation calls for it. She's not doing it maladaptively. She's doing it as I have a skill for that. And really, that's the deeper goal, freedom, not perfection.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. And you talk a lot about emotional drivers. And again, you have every other week is a series on emotional drivers. So just for our audience to really understand, why do you talk about emotional drivers? It's ultimately the metaphysical messages behind the symptoms or diseases that people can hold, right? So what is the emotional driver, the metaphysical, symbolic message behind ADHD?
Yes, great question. At a symbolic level, ADHD can be seen as like the soul or the spirit's rebellion against a world that has tried to compress it. It's a refusal to conform to unnatural pacing. Like we move really fast and we process enormous amounts of information.
Super fast.
And we were not designed to do that. And the effect that has on our body is very negative. And, we're also taught, and the body rebels against abandoning curiosity for compliance. ADHD shows up when there's been a mismatch between like the depth of our being and then the narrow lanes that society tries to put on us and offers to us for our expression. So in this sense, ADHD isn't dysfunction. It's disobedience to fragmentation. It's like our psyche is saying, I will not silence my imagination. I will not abandon my emotional truth. I will not trade wonder for rigidity. From this lens, ADHD is an urgent invitation to realign with our essence, not abandon it.
I love that.
We've also noticed that many clients who've rewired ADHD need to do some reparenting or some relearning on how to navigate feeling more instead of feeling less.
Within themselves.
Yes.
Okay.
For instance, learning discernment between reaction and intuition, the reclamation of self-trust after decades of external correction, also healing performance-based love, reconnecting to the body after years of disembodiment, and restoring creativity as a core identity, not as a side effect. So ADHD often acts like a divine disruptor, blowing up what is inauthentic, unsustainable, or overly compressed. So it doesn't mean necessarily that you're scattered. It means that your current containers are too small for your spirit, too small for what we should be doing.
Okay, so then can someone with ADHD change their identity from this dysregulated state, this dysregulation, to something that is wise and adaptive and whole? And if so, which obviously you've answered some of that already, but like, what are some of the basic things, or let's say practicals, that someone might want to address when they're beginning this journey of like, okay, so I've identified myself in a number of what this podcast is, a number of things there. I'm recognizing it's something I do, not something I am. So what are some things I can do?
This is where mind change identity work becomes critical. And by that, we mean, what is the identity I've created about myself, the beliefs I have about myself? And so how do we begin? I mean, the first thing would be to kind of name that old identity or that old belief system. So some of the core ones are, I'm broken, I can't focus, I always screw things up, my brain is broken, there's something wrong with me, right? Those are not facts. They're emotional echoes.
I mean, they're facts for the person, but that's just because it's their reality.
Right. And it's practiced and they have a lot of resources from it. But the resources are echoing back from their past, from the environments that they were raised in or schooled in.
Perceived proofs.
So we begin by going back and finding the places where you learned how to do this, how to feel this. We find those subconscious drivers for these negative core beliefs. And once those memories and neural pathways have been changed, then we can begin to craft a new identity, a felt state. So identity is shaped by repetition and beliefs and resources, plus emotional charge.
Say that again so people can really get that in.
So to change an identity, to create a new identity with a felt state, you have to go back and you have to rewire those things, create resources. So you've seen it, felt it, feel it, and it's different, it's changed. And then you repeat it. So we rehearse that, we repeat it, and we add emotional charge to it.
Okay, can I add one thing that is inferred but not necessarily didn't state, which is when you go back, we have to first deconstruct those old neural pathways, the old seeings, feelings, hearings, like all of that stuff that you find those truths, I am this, I am that, like, or experiences. You have to first deconstruct those neural pathways so that you can't see, feel, hear them anymore. Then reconstruct, redesign, rewire, and add all of that stuff. That's just really important because I want to make sure that as we're giving people practicals, that it's not just like, oh, I identify it and then I create something new and put it on top. And it just becomes another behavior, another mantra, another thing that you're putting on top of all of the stuff that's actually stored in your cellular memory body.
That's 99% of what we see out there of any sort of modality, even those that call themselves subconscious rewiring. They are reframing. They're dumping good on bad. They're trying to tip the scales.
Yeah, I have a lot of people that I just had someone come in this last week, and they were telling me like, oh, and I've worked through this and this and this, and I'm like, okay, well, so tell me about that then. And they just go right back into the story. And they're like, well, now it's like different because I understand this and that. And it's that reframe of like, okay, so you opened yourself up to another possibility as being let's just call it like a different dimensional possibility of something happening. But the truth is what they're storing and holding in their body is actually what's going to ring true in their day-to-day neural pathways.
100%. The subconscious programming always wins.
Yeah.
And if we're just trying to tell a different story about it, we're doing the same thing to that little child that was done to them that created the problems in the first place. Was, yeah, well, that happened and that happened and that happened. But you know what? Kind of buck up, kiddo. It's all going to be okay. And rather, no, how about we change that?
Yeah.
Instead of just reframing it. Because it's all about, do I have the skill, the practiced, resourced, known skill to do something different instead? To do that, you have to have the environment that taught you those things. If that's not done, you've not done the work. It'll come back in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then what would be the final emotional message you want people with ADHD to hold on to really hear?
Well, the first thing is you are not broken. You were never broken. In fact, you were brilliantly adaptive. You learned to speed up, check out, or explode because it kept you safe. But you're no longer that child.
Okay, for just a moment. Say a couple of those things again for me.
Okay. You are not broken. You were never broken. You are brilliantly adaptive. You learned these coping skills. You learned to speed up, check out, hyper focus, not still sit still, to explode, because at the time in those environments, it kept you safe.
So everyone listening, watching, just take that in for a second. Take a deep breath. Okay.
You are not that child anymore. You are no longer that child. Now you get to rewrite the rules.
Yeah.
Now you get that thing you always wanted when you were in school or when you were little. You get to be brilliant. You get to create. You get to make up worlds. You get to indulge in that. You get to live by your own set of rules that work for you. And the goal here isn't to become neurotypical. It's to become integrated, where all parts of you are welcome, functional, and free. That's what the goal is here.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the research. Thanks for helping us have a different kind of understanding of this thing that is very real for people and yet can be completely transformed.
Listen, this, I understand this may not sit well for some. But there might be a time later on that it will, when the medication journey, which feels, and I get this for people, I did this a lot in my own chronic illness journey, is that initial improvement, it feels like the victory. And it's like, oh, this is what I needed. I needed this, Vyvanse, Adderall, Ritalin. And listen, some people, we're not here to vilify medication. Not at all. But it's interesting, and it's probably would be its own podcast about what actually is happening with those medications. I mean, they're a form of like a methamphetamine. So it's a speed thing that ironically is being given to slow the brain down. That tells me right there's an initial issue that if there needs to be something given to speed up, and yet we're calling it hyperactivity, then we've got something working really out of alignment there. I have a ton of information on this. I've done a lot of research
on this.
And so again, we're not vilifying medication,
Right.
But what is undeniable is that a lot of those medications come with side effects and over long, especially for children. And these medications have impact on a developing brain. I don't know that we even know the amount of impact it has on a developing brain. So what if there's a different approach? What if there might be a different way? We're not saying to go off of your medication or that medication is bad or take away the victory that you feel like you've had with medication. But what if there's actually nothing wrong with you? And what if there's a different way to get all those things that you need that aren't reliant on a pill? Just what if? And so I think it's something to consider. I'd like for this to be out there as a consideration, as a possible option, as a possible way of seeing what you're doing is a possible superpower and not a problem. And what if it could be in your actual control? And what if it was a really good reason for doing it in the first place? Personally, for children, I think that could change so many things. But even for adults that are possibly doing this, dealing with ADHD, I just want to be part of the conversation. Thanks for talking, for chatting, for being here.
Yeah.
It's a good thing for us to talk about. I think it's been long overdue.
Glad we were here to talk about it.
And thank all of you for joining us as we did this kind of powerful dive into the emotional and neurological roots of ADHD. If anything you heard today resonated, if it sparked clarity, softened your self-judgment, or lit a fire of hope, we invite you to explore mind change a little bit more deeply. We are not here to pathologize you. We are here to help you understand the wisdom of your brain and your nervous system and give you tools to rewire it. Your brain is not your enemy. It's your ally. And the moment you start listening to it with curiosity instead of shame is the moment everything begins to change. So please share this episode with someone who needs to feel seen. And as always, stay curious, stay connected, and stay kind to your mind. Until next time, this is the Mind Change Podcast, where we are changing the world one mind at a time.